life before cell phones, we would leave home every day with no easy way to contact the people we planned to meet up with, or the people we depended on to pick us up from school or work. There was no way for someone to call us if we were away from home, to say that traffic was bad or they were running late, or to be reminded of what to buy at the supermarket. And through all those years, we were fine. We didn't wring our hands and wish someone would hurry up already and invent cell phones. We didn't know the future would be so much easier. Later, we didn't wish that smartphones would show up. And it wasn't long before we were able to watch cat videos while standing in line for coffee. The technology that we had was all we thought we needed. When something new came along to change everything, it was a surprise. I mention this because we tend to look back at history and note all the things that were missing in any given era. What did they do without clocks? No printing press, no wheel, no plow, no plumbing. But of course, we have perfect hindsight and can see what an advantage it was to have those things once they were invented. The people who lived without them didn't know what they were missing. We also tend to assume that once a new technology appeared, it must have been adopted with relish. But was that true? It's often been observed that the spread of any technology tends to be slow. People don't leap to adopt the invention. First they wonder, what is it? Why might it be useful? How much does it cost? These aren't obvious at the time. You probably can think of examples like this in your own lifetime. I remember reading a magazine article about the internet in the early 90s and being completely mystified. How could one visit sites on a computer? What would be the point of doing so? We seemed to be getting along just fine without this new internet thing. Little did we know. All this brings us to the question of how and why agriculture originated and spread. The when and where are relatively uncontroversial. Early agriculture originated about 10,500 years ago in the Near East, around northwestern Syria and southern Turkey. But how and why? Those are thorny questions. Looking backwards from the present, we can see the enormous value of the domestication of plants and animals. And it's tempting to imagine that through all the thousands of years that humans were hunting animals and gathering plants, they were just longing for someone to get around to inventing farming, an invention that would allow them to stay in one place all year round and start accumulating possessions. Early theories often credited some ancient genius with noticing that plants grew from seeds in waste piles, and then planting seeds himself and finding that they grew. Voila, agriculture. According to this view, the self-evident advantage of farming would have resulted in mass abandonment of hunting and gathering and a quick shift to living in villages and storing surpluses. I'm exaggerating a little, but there was a sense that agriculture was an example of progress. There was also a sense that hunters and gatherers were, without doubt, at a disadvantage, and therefore would have been keen to become farmers. The problem is that this is based on the same hindsight that makes us wonder what people did without clocks or phones. They did fine. Modern groups of hunters and gatherers are in no hurry to start to farm, and the same was probably true in the Neolithic period. People didn't feel themselves to be lacking in some way, subject to a void that could only be filled by farming and herding. So what happened? Can the origin of agriculture even be called an invention? Or was it a process that carried people along? What can archaeology tell us? We now know that early settlements were clearly built before the domestication of plants and animals. That's not what scholars originally thought. People didn't settle because farming allowed them to. They settled first, and then later, maybe 3,000 years later, they started to farm. Furthermore, the men and women who first started building settlements weren't the cavemen of cartoons. They were fully modern humans. If you could have frozen an embryo of an early settler for 12,000 years, he or she would grow up completely unremarkable in the modern world. No doubt texting on a smartphone, struggling to get good grades in college, and going out with friends after work. The first settlers were anatomically and intellectually modern, and they had languages that were probably just as sophisticated and expressive as modern languages are. People tend to think that language was invented when writing was, but writing came thousands and thousands of years after people had begun to talk. So the early settlers could communicate easily with one another about their lives and concerns. They just didn't have our technology. In the same way, the early settlers had already been gathering grains for millennia, and of course they must have known that plants grew from seeds. Hunting and gathering simply worked well, so they didn't need to plant their seeds to make their own food. What is a surprise is that modern hunters and gatherers have a lot more leisure time than the farmers who use the simple technologies available to them. For example, hunters and gatherers known as the Kalahari Bushmen, who today live in a vast expanse in southern Africa, spent only about 12 to 19 hours a week collecting their food, according to one well-documented study. Whereas neighbouring farmers worked for at least 14 more hours a week to feed themselves. Farming is tough. Crops can fail. There are pests and diseases to worry about. One has to sow seeds, weed the fields, tend the crops, possibly water the crops if rainfall is scarce, and then harvest them. And once the harvest is in, how do you protect your food from yet more pests or mold or damp? Hunting and gathering, in comparison, is all about harvesting, leaving nature to take care of the rest. The 20th century Kalahari hunters and gatherers ate about 75 different wild plants, so they had a wide selection to draw from, and they wouldn't starve if one or even several plants suffered from a pest or was unavailable. Skeletal evidence also shows that early farmers were shorter and sicker than hunters and gatherers who came before them. Hunters and gatherers in pre-Neolithic Greece and Turkey were similar in height to modern men and women, an average of 5'9" for the men and 5'3" for the women. Once they started to farm, though, they got a lot shorter. By 3000 BCE, the men in the same region averaged 5'3" and the women 5 foot. This could be because farmers' diets were more restricted than the diets of hunters and gatherers, and farmers ate a lot more bread and a lot less meat than hunters did. Early farmers also had much worse teeth. Since wheat and barley need to be ground into flour to become edible, the grit from the grindstones got in their food, and it wore down their teeth. Women, who spent hours and hours every day kneeling to grind the grain, wound up with toe bones permanently fused into a crouching position. Given all these disadvantages, who would choose to farm? Some of the most popular theories suggest that humans were forced into farming, that it wasn't a choice at all. The earliest hunting and gathering settlements were located near abundant natural resources. Ideally, these included a spring or river that provided drinking water and attracted animals, as well as a source of flint for stone tools and a naturally occurring meadow full of barley or wheat. This is known as a stand of barley or wheat. Once a year, when the wild grain was ripe, it would have been harvested. In a famous experiment, a 20th century American archaeologist named Jack Harlan made a Neolithic-style sickle and harvested grain from a stand of wild einkorn wheat in Turkey. He was able to collect about 1 kilogram of clean grain, that is, about 2.2 pounds, every hour. Given the amount of wild grain that was growing in the region during the Neolithic period, Harlan estimated that a family of 4 could have harvested a metric ton of wheat over the course of 3 weeks. And since grain doesn't rot the way that fruits and vegetables do, this could have fed the family for a whole year. The problem was that huge amounts of grain couldn't be carried around. It needed to be stored somewhere. And once the grain was stored, there must have been a strong motivation to stay near it. This might be the original logic behind settling in one place. If that place provided food year-round, there was no need to keep following herds or to travel from place to place. A permanent shelter could be constructed, and heavy objects, such as grinding stones for processing the grain, could be kept there. The population probably grew as a result. Women could have their babies closer together because they didn't have to carry their infants around. These early settlers weren't farming, but they were starting to live with some of the disadvantages of farming that I mentioned a moment ago. They had started to depend on fewer plants for most of their calories, especially grains, so their diets were more limited and their teeth began to suffer. They had to devote time and attention to protecting the grain that they'd harvested, even though it was wild. And if a disease or drought affected their wild stand of grain and their harvest was smaller than usual, they faced a bigger problem than before. More than 14,000 years ago, in a region that includes parts of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, people belonging to what we called the Natufian culture lived just this way, living in built shelters and making the best use of the resources in their region. The area where the Natufians settled got plenty of rainfall and was where you'd find the wild ancestors of modern wheat, barley, rye, peas, lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. In some ways, they were really lucky. They had more than just the makings of a healthy diet, they also had access to a group of species that they would end up being able to manipulate. Not many animals are particularly suited to domestication. For example, zebra don't like to be ridden, and gazelles don't follow one another in herds. So in some parts of the world, no amount of human intervention would have succeeded at domestication. The animals would have stayed just as uncontrollable as before. But in the Eastern Mediterranean area, known as the Levant, domestication wasn't a problem. Wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle were particularly domesticable. That lay far in the future, however. We're looking at the world in about 12,500 BCE. Excavations from Natufian sites show us that these people created houses by digging circular pits and building walls of stone or wood and roofing them with reeds or hides. Smaller pits dug near the houses were lined with limestone, and they allowed the early settlers to store food, such as wild wheat and barley, for long periods of time. As many as 100 people lived near one another in villages made up of these round houses. Besides benefiting from the wild grains that grew in the area, villagers also hunted birds and gazelle. Vast amounts of gazelle bones have been found at some of the Natufian sites. There seems to have been plenty to eat. In order to hunt and to harvest wild plants, the people developed complex and beautiful stone tools. This was long before anyone thought up the technology necessary to make metal tools. The Natufians hadn't even invented pottery yet. They had fire, they cooked over it, and they used it for protection and for warmth. But its potential was still relatively unharnessed. So, all man-made objects had to be shaped by hand, and this was an exacting and time-consuming process, one that none of us today could master without years of training. The stoneworkers made tiny flint blades 1 to 3 centimeters long, with perfectly straight edges for slicing or fine serrations for cutting. These are known as microliths, and they would have been fitted into bone hafts or handles to make sickles, arrows, and knives. Each shape of blade had a specific purpose. A stone cutter holding a nodule of flint would have looked at it with an expert eye, seeing exactly where he would be able to coax a particular shape of blade out of its core by hitting it at just the right angle. Other types of stone were ground into larger shapes, such as mortars, pestles, and bowls of various kinds. The Natufian people also made bone tools, such as hooks for fishing. Fish was important to their diet as well. And they made needles for weaving. The baskets, mats, and fabrics they wove have long since disintegrated. as all organic materials do in a humid environment. But it's likely that women and men developed advanced skills in these areas. Some of us might think of ourselves as much more sophisticated than Natufian villagers, but how many of us could weave a basket? Beads were popular too, especially beads made from seashells, and these were strung into necklaces, bracelets, and headdresses. All of this was possible without farming, because the climate was kind and natural resources were abundant. The people might even have had some sort of belief in a life after death. We can guess this because they buried their loved ones in cemeteries near their settlements, accompanied by flowers and sometimes dogs. Wolves were domesticated to become dogs right around this time. One dramatic Natufian burial, in a pit inside a cave in Israel, included the body of a 45-year-old woman who was buried with all sorts of surprising things. 50 tortoise shells, the tail of a wild cow, the pelvis of a leopard, the wing bone of an eagle, the forearm of a wild boar, a stone bowl, and a severed human foot, a foot much larger than her own. A ring of stones surrounded her grave and separated it from 27 others. The excavator concluded she was probably a shaman, someone who practiced healing and was viewed as holy in some way. Shamans probably were effective in their practice. What we now think of as the placebo effect would have worked well then too. People who believe they will get well often do. Their bodies rally to fight off infection. The shamans might also have found cures for pain or illness among the many plants available to them. All in all, life in a Natufian village probably seemed pretty good, at least for the first couple of thousand years. Food and water were plentiful, and men and women developed sophisticated skills in making tools, buildings, clothes, and baskets. They had children who grew up and had children of their own. They could defend themselves against wild animals and protect themselves from the elements. They probably told stories in the evenings, and being human, they sang songs. This must have seemed to be the way that life had always been and always would continue to be. So why did these people, sometimes in the very same villages where they had lived as hunters and gatherers, begin to farm? The fact that they did so is clear. A few thousand years later, the distinctly transformed shapes of domesticated grains, pulses, like lentils and peas, and animals show that these species had become dependent on humans for their existence. Farmers gradually chose and bred plants with bigger seeds, sheep with longer wool, and so on. Some scholars think this was an unconscious process. They call it unconscious selection. They believe that farmers didn't set out to plant larger grains that would produce more food, but instead, various attributes of the grains and animals were selected for by natural processes that resulted from harvesting wild foods and taking care of young animals. Other scholars point out just how much modern hunters and gatherers know about their foods, including, for example, how to make poisonous plants edible through cooking and other processing. They think that the same could have been true in ancient times. In that case, domestication could have been quite conscious. These were smart men and women who observed new mutations of plants that occurred naturally and took advantage of them. Unfortunately, for those of us asking these questions today, the physical changes that mark plants and animals as domesticated took place a long time after domestication started. So it's not possible to mark an exact date when the process began. One popular theory as to why people started to farm is that they were spurred to do so by a changing climate. Around 11,000 years ago, the weather in the Near East got colder and drier than it had been. The plants and animals that had reliably appeared in the past, simply needing to be gathered up or hunted, became scarcer. Some communities gave up and moved. Others clung on, perhaps supplementing their diets by beginning to plant the foods that they depended on, or by keeping young animals that would grow and be useful to them. Some of the animals that were native to this area had temperaments that lent themselves to being herded, sheep, goats, and cattle, for example. The process was extremely gradual, according to this theory. Although the domestication of plants and animals is often referred to as the agricultural revolution, it happened so slowly that it was probably invisible to the people living through it. Another theory is that settlements themselves caused the problem that ended up being solved, to some extent anyway, by domestication. The villagers had always focused their attention on the immediate area, which created environmental stress. Intense foraging and hunting destabilized the natural environment. In this case, a small trigger could suddenly limit resources dramatically. This could be a sudden increase in plant pests, for example, or a change in the movement patterns of gazelle, or a swarm of locusts. Farming and herding would have helped protect the villagers against these disasters. Or perhaps, according to yet another theory, the Natufian villagers were so successful that they grew too numerous for their local environments. The growing population couldn't be supported by continuing to hunt and gather in the immediate vicinity. So they might have started farming right where they lived in order to increase the food supply. By the way, an earlier generation of scholars hypothesized that a population increase forced people out of the central zone where the plants and animals were present. They proposed that these migrant populations then moved into marginal zones and brought the plants and animals with them, farming and herding in a region where it was not possible to hunt and gather. It's a nice theory, and it was popular when I was in grad school. But archaeologists have proved it wrong. Farming doesn't seem to have originated in these marginal zones at all. Instead, it began right around where the earlier villages first settled. A combination of theories is also possible. Perhaps climate change added to the stress on a population that had grown too large for the resources available and had already been subject to destabilization because of the overutilization of the natural resources. A very recent theory about domestication, put forward by the Israeli archaeologist Avi Gofer and the agronomist Shahal Abo, rejects the idea that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming was slow. They think it was well planned and happened surprisingly fast, in one place. Their theory holds that proto-farmers were conscious that they had selected particular seeds to plant, the very seeds that were most likely to sprout. These same proto-farmers focused on 6 species at the same time: barley, 2 types of wheat, flax, lentils, and chickpeas. In this view, they were wise planners, men and women who knew they needed the plants to be more productive than was true in the wild, and who bred them precisely for this purpose. Aside from this theory, however, it has been unpopular for quite a while to talk about the invention of farming and herding. The emphasis has been on a long process, with incremental steps along the way, that ultimately resulted in a totally different lifestyle. Most scholars believe that people didn't choose to be farmers. Who would choose that, given the disadvantages? Instead, over thousands of years, they came to depend more on the foods that they nurtured themselves and less on the foods that they gathered in the wild. No one would have any recollection of what it was like to be a pure hunter-gatherer by the time they were totally dependent on farming. And even then, they still hunted and gathered. In a way, we still do. If you go fishing, or if you gather and eat blackberries in late summer from wild bushes, or if you search for mushrooms in the forest, you're keeping a little bit of that hunting and gathering heritage alive. For now, it's impossible to know which of the many theories about the origins of the domestication of plants and animals is correct. Scholars disagree. One remarkable piece of recent evidence, though, has shaken up our image of the hunters and gatherers in the Near East. It turns out they were not only intelligent, but also organized and passionate about their beliefs, in a way that was completely hidden before. The discovery is at a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey. About 12,000 years ago, long before farming, when humans were just beginning to settle in hunting and gathering communities, a group of people erected a monument at Göbekli Tepe to their gods. It consisted of huge circles of standing stones. One of the circles is 65 feet across, and the largest of the stones weighs 16 tons. These stones are T-shaped and engraved with images of predatory and poisonous animals. The engravings are not of the prey the people of this time hunted. There are no images of gazelle or sheep or goats. Instead, they carved lions, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and foxes. There doesn't seem to have been a settlement nearby, but according to the excavators, hundreds of people must have been involved in the construction. They had to quarry the stones, drag them into position, and stand them upright. Then they engraved the images and built the walls. This took organization. Someone was in charge. The project must also have required food and water for the workers, and perhaps shelter. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who directed the excavation, proposed yet another reason for the development of agriculture. He theorized that perhaps in order to feed the workmen on this project, it was not enough to hunt and gather. They needed a more reliable source of large amounts of food. Perhaps they grew it themselves. We also have to wonder, why was this monument built? Were these the images of the gods whom the hunters and gatherers feared? Were they attempting to control natural dangers by erecting images of them? Did they bury the dead nearby? It's a mystery. Nobody invented writing for another 7,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built, so the people of this era had no way to tell us. People certainly must have visited the site after it was built, perhaps traveling from hundreds of miles away. There's archaeological evidence of feasts taking place, huge stone bowls that would have held 40 gallons of liquid, beer maybe, and giant piles of animal bones. Visitors must have met others, shared ideas, and perhaps worshipped together. It seems that religious beliefs were already a powerful force on human behavior, even before pottery, before farming, before almost anything we define as civilization. To sum up, farming and herding completely changed the course of human history, but they didn't necessarily present an obvious advantage to the first farmers. Farming also developed independently in China, the New World, Africa, and other regions. And in each case, it was probably a lengthy process, all but invisible to each subsequent generation. People probably thought they were doing things just the same way they always had. But after 3,000 years of very slow change, once agriculture dominated the economy, things began to change more quickly.